The deck lurched without warning. 4 towering columns of seawater erupted around the hull, 2 off the port side, 2 to starboard. Red-hot fragments sizzled beneath the surface as the explosions hammered the hull like a giant fist. Lieutenant Commander Bernard H. Kaczynski slammed the general alarm and yelled for flank speed, the ship vibrating as the screws dug into the dark water. Below, men scrambled from their bunks in the red glow of battle lights. No one knew if the next salvo would tear through the thin steel. The source remained a mystery: guns ashore, a stray bomber, or a rocket from a friendly plane. But the message was clear. This small ship had entered a deadly arena, and every second could be the last. How did a crew of civilians find themselves in that gauntlet off Okinawa? The story begins months earlier, on the 1st of May, 1944, in Orange, Texas. Along the banks of the Sabine River, the USS Abercrombie DE-343 was commissioned. The commissioning pennant, a long streamer of white and red, snapped in the Gulf breeze for the first time. Kaczynski, a brisk and exacting officer, took command. His executive officer, Lieutenant John R. Hicks, and the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Thomas N. Parlin, stood with him on the bridge. The crew of 216 men, most of them reservists fresh from civilian life, began the urgent work of fitting out a warship. Within weeks, Abercrombie sailed for shakedown in Bermuda. Under the relentless Caribbean sun, the crew drilled on guns, engineering, and damage control, learning the ship's every quirk. Then came the long transit through the Panama Canal, a brief stop in San Diego, and finally Pearl Harbor. There, beneath the green slopes of Diamond Head, they trained for war. Lieutenant J.G. Edward P. Stafford worked alongside the Black Gang to master the boilers. A tough electrician's mate from New Bedford kept the ship's wiring alive. In late September, Abercrombie crossed the equator and the international date line, bound for the forward base at Manus. The war was waiting. Abercrombie steamed into Seidler Harbor at Manus in the first days of October. The island base was a sprawling anchorage, crammed with warships and supply vessels. For the crew, this was the threshold of war. They had trained for months, crossed oceans, and now the real work was about to begin. Routine patrols and escort duties came first, but on the morning of October 23rd, the ship received a desperate radio call. A downed Navy pilot was adrift in the waters off the Palau Islands, exhausted and clinging to a raft. Kaczynski set a course at flank speed. Lookouts spotted the raft late in the afternoon, a small speck on the rolling sea. The ship slowed and maneuvered alongside. Crew members lowered a cargo net, and a pair of sailors jumped into the water to help the pilot aboard. Bridge was weak, dehydrated, and barely conscious. The rescue was completed without incident, but the tension was palpable. Enemy submarines were known to prowl these waters. Once Bridge was safely on deck and rushed to sickbay, the ship returned to its patrol. The crew had saved a life, and the sight of the exhausted pilot in the wardroom reminded every man of the fragility of their own existence. 2 days later, on October 25th, Abercrombie found herself at the edge of a naval apocalypse. The battle off Samar was raging to the north and east. Japanese battleships and cruisers had overwhelmed the escort carrier groups. Over the radio came the desperate calls of destroyers and destroyer escorts charging the enemy fleet. Abercrombie was part of a screen protecting the carriers of Taffy 2. The ship never closed with the Japanese surface force, but the crew saw the towering gunfire on the horizon and heard the frantic radio chatter. One name came through the static again and again. Samuel B. Roberts, a sister ship of their own class, was fighting for her life. Later that afternoon, word came that the Samuel B. Roberts had been sunk. She had charged the Japanese cruisers, firing torpedoes and shells, until she was battered beneath the waves by heavy gunfire. Abercrombie was ordered to search for survivors. The crew manned the rails, scanning the oil-slicked water for any sign of life. That night, the crew learned the fate of the Samuel B. Roberts, a sister ship lost with most of her crew. The news settled over the mess decks like a lead weight. At dawn on October 26th, the fleet was steaming in formation under the early morning light. Abercrombie was maneuvering to maintain her screening position when the escort carrier Manila Bay appeared suddenly out of the darkness. The two ships were on a converging course. Kaczynski ordered an emergency turn, but the distance was too short. Abercrombie's port bow struck the Manila Bay's starboard quarter, with a grinding crunch of metal. The impact sent men stumbling across the decks. Alarms sounded, and damage control parties rushed to assess the wound. For a long moment, the crew braced for worse. Kaczynski backed the engines immediately, pulling the ships apart. The damage was superficial, a dented hull and some twisted plating, but no breaches and no flooding. Most importantly, not a single man on either ship was injured. Within hours, both vessels were back in formation, continuing their mission. The collision was a sobering reminder that the sea itself was a threat, even when the enemy was not near. But the quick containment of the damage showed the crew that their training had paid off. Abercrombie had entered the crucible of war, and she had emerged intact, with her crew forged a little harder, a little more ready for what was to come. On November 10, 1944, the USS Abercrombie lay at anchor in Saydler Harbor at Manus, still carrying the dents from her collision with the Manila Bay. The crew was catching its breath after the chaos of the battle off Samar, repairing damage and taking on supplies. At mid-morning, without warning, a blinding white flash erupted from the ammunition ship Mount Hood, moored less than 2,000 yards away. The blast was enormous, a detonation that hurled massive chunks of steel thousands of feet into the air and sent a shockwave racing across the harbor at the speed of sound. The concussion slammed into Abercrombie's hull like a hammer, rattling every man on board. Stafford, standing near the engine room hatch, felt the deck buck beneath his feet. A rain of debris began to fall, twisted metal fragments, scraps of clothing, pieces of a ship that had simply ceased to exist. The Mount Hood had vanished, leaving only a spreading oil slick and a column of black smoke where she had been. Every man on the Abercrombie knew that the ammunition ship had been carrying hundreds of tons of explosives, and that no one aboard her had survived. The blast had damaged every ship within a mile radius. Abercrombie's sister ship, the Oberenda, took the worst of it. Her superstructure peppered with shrapnel, her hull holed in several places. Kaczynski ordered damage control parties to stand by, but the Mount Hood's destruction was total and instantaneous. There was no fire to fight, no survivors to rescue. For the rest of the day, the crew of the Abercrombie worked in silence, hosing debris off the decks and patching the superficial damage caused by the shockwave. They had witnessed what modern naval ammunition could do when it let go all at once, a sobering preview of the violence still to come. 3 weeks later, the Abercrombie sailed south for the invasion of Luzon. The force entered the Mindanao Sea on the last day of the year, threading through a maze of islands under a low, grey sky. On the morning of January 5, 1945, as the formation approached the entrance to Lingayen Gulf, the air crackled with radar warnings. Japanese planes were coming in low, skimming the waves. Abercrombie's gunners stayed at their stations, scanning the overcast horizon. Then, off the starboard bow, a column of fire erupted from the destroyer, Escort Stafford, a sister ship, a ship they knew, as a kamikaze slammed into her bridge structure. Parlin watched through his binoculars as the Stafford staggered, smoke pouring from her superstructure. The kamikaze had struck just forward of her stack, demolishing the galley deckhouse and starting raging fires. The Stafford's crew fought the fires with desperate determination, and within an hour she was under control, limping toward the anchorage. The Abercrombie slid into her screening station, guns trained skyward, as the invasion transports pushed past the burning destroyer toward the beaches. For 4 days, the ship patrolled the Gulf, firing at enemy planes that came in waves, each attack more determined than the last. On the morning of January 10th, with the beachhead secured and the kamikaze attacks tapering off, a lookout spotted a small, dark object bobbing in the chop off the port bow. It was an outrigger canoe, capsized and half-submerged. Clinging to the hull were 3 Filipino fishermen, exhausted and terrified. Kaczynski ordered the ship to slow, and a rescue party launched one of the rubber rafts. The men were hauled aboard, shivering in ragged cotton shirts, their feet cut from scrambling across coral. The crew gave them dry clothes, hot coffee, and a meal, the first decent food they had eaten in days. Before the ship sailed, the fishermen were transferred to a passing landing craft. It was a small mercy in the midst of a violent campaign, and it reminded the men of the Abercrombie why they had come to the Pacific in the first place. After Lingayen, the Abercrombie steamed back to Leyte for replenishment and repairs. The ship settled into a familiar rhythm of maintenance drills and short patrols. But beneath the surface discipline, tensions were building. Harry Miles, a first-class electrician's mate from New Bedford, Massachusetts, was a skilled technician and a devoted family man, but when he drank, his temper turned ugly. On the afternoon of February 13th, the wardroom was cleared of furniture, the mess table covered with green baize, and a summary court-martial was convened. Miles was charged with assaulting a shipmate, striking a crewman named Combs under circumstances that the prosecution argued were willful and without just cause. Stafford served as Miles's defense counsel, arguing that while the striking had occurred, it was not malicious, that Miles had been provoked, that his violence was a symptom of the crushing loneliness and frustration of months at sea. The court, originally composed of Hicks and two other officers, was successfully challenged for bias by the defense, and a new panel was seated. The trial lasted all afternoon, with witnesses called, testimony weighed, and paragraphs of naval courts and boards consulted by the light of battle lamps. Miles was found guilty and fined, but he was not reduced in rate, a small victory that kept him at his post in the after-steering compartment, where he tended the emergency rudder controls and kept company with the ship's mascot, a Boston Terrier named Butch. A few days later, the Abercrombie pulled into Ulithi Atoll for rest. It was there that the tension between Miles and the wardroom boiled over in an unexpected way. Lieutenant Junior Grade Melvin Rosenberg, a quiet payroll auditor from civilian life, was serving as officer in charge of the Liberty Party on Mogmog Island. Miles, having consumed his ration of beer, turned ugly and began threatening his shipmates. Rosenberg confronted him, and when Miles snarled that the officer was hiding behind his gold braid, Rosenberg stripped off his shirt and offered to settle the matter with boxing gloves. In a 15-foot circle drawn on the fantail, the two men fought 3 rounds, Miles the street brawler, Rosenberg the boxer. No decision was declared, but the handshake that ended the fight was genuine. After that night, the electrician's mate was heard to say that Rosenberg was the best damn officer on the ship. The Abercrombie spent the rest of February and early March in and out of Leyte Gulf, preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. On the morning of March 12th, a strong northeasterly wind kicked up the sea, driving 5 to 8 foot swells into the anchorage. The ship's whaleboat was dispatched on a routine run to deliver men to an LCI and a pier ashore. The coxswain handled the LCI delivery smoothly, timing the waves to match the landing craft's deck. But the stone pier was unforgiving. A wave caught the boat's bow and smashed it against the pilings. The whaleboat's side splintered, and seawater gushed through the broken planking. The rudder was ripped off in a second impact. Costner's crew, engineer Jim Bell and seaman Jack Green, struggled to keep the diesel running as Costner steered with an emergency paddle. Green bailed frantically, but the boat was losing ground to the incoming water. A passing LCM threw them a line and towed the crippled whaleboat to an anchored cargo ship, where a temporary patch was rigged. But the sea was too rough, the patch failed, and the boat began to founder. Green, not about to lose his ship's only boat, jumped back aboard to secure a new line, and was promptly knocked overboard by a breaking wave. He swam to a nearby transport, where he tried to have the boat hoisted out, but the officer of the deck refused, citing the weight of the water filling the hull. With the whaleboat half swamped and the wind setting on shore, the decision was made to cut her loose and let her drift to the beach for later salvage. Costner, Bell, and Green returned to the Abercrombie cold, exhausted, and soaking wet. The next morning, the ship got underway for 3 days of rehearsals for the Okinawa landings, but Stafford did not forget the whaleboat. On March 19th, he took a salvage party ashore, found the boat canted on its side, half filled with sand, and spent hours digging it out and patching the hole with plywood. A Duquois from the army base pulled the boat to the waterline, and the crew paddled her out to sea, where an LSM took them in tow. The patched whaleboat was hoisted aboard, dirty and dented but floating. A Navy yard had built that boat. A crew of civilians and reservists had brought her back from the dead. She would serve again, just as the Abercrombie herself would serve in the storm that was coming. The last days of March saw the Abercrombie steaming north from Leyte, part of a vast armada converging on Okinawa. The ship took her place on the outer screen, a chain of patrol stations known as the Ping Line, which wrapped around the invasion beaches. The crew knew this would be the worst yet. The enemy had thrown hundreds of kamikazes at the fleet, and every man felt the weight of what was coming. On the 1st of April, Easter Sunday, the landings began. Abercrombie's patrol sector lay southwest of Keramaretto, out of sight of the main action. That afternoon, the ship received a grim task: 2 Japanese airmen were floating in the sea nearby, and the captain ordered them recovered for possible intelligence. Boats and men went over the side in a rubber raft. They pulled the first body aboard, then the second. The pilots were young, wearing quilted kapok life jackets and cheap wool uniforms. One had a deep wound in his forehead. In his wallet they found a photograph, a smiling young man in white shorts, sitting in the sun on a doorstep. It was the same face that now lay grey and waterlogged on the deck. The crew searched the bodies, fingerprinted them, and sewed them into canvas tubes weighted with 5-inch projectiles. At 1852, they returned the remains to the sea, but the photograph lingered. It cracked the stereotype of the hated enemy, if only for a moment, and left the men staring at something they could not easily dismiss. The face of a boy who might have been any of them. 2 nights later, the war came back with a different kind of urgency. The Abercrombie was steaming on night retirement when a chorus of shouting rose from the water off the starboard side. Men were screaming, desperate, frantic. The officer of the deck ran to the wing and saw dark shapes disappearing into the white wake of the ship's 15-knot passage. The general alarm sounded. The ship swung around and slowed, while lookouts kept their eyes fixed on the men in the water. A rubber raft was readied and launched. Stafford took the oars, with the carpenter's mate, known as Chips, on the line. In the darkness and chop, they rowed toward the faint shapes. They found 4 sailors clinging to an empty oil drum. One was nearly unconscious. Another had both hands badly burned. All were exhausted and half drowned. One by one they were dragged into the raft. Back alongside, the rolling ship made the transfer treacherous, but the rescue detail hauled every man aboard. The survivors were rushed to sick bay. These were the last survivors of the destroyer Dickerson, which had been crashed by a kamikaze hours earlier. 52 men had died instantly. The 4 in the water had been there for 9 hours, supported by a single comrade, who held 2 others afloat for the last 4 hours. The Abercrombie's course error of a couple of degrees would have cut them apart with the screws. Instead, they lived. The days blurred into a sleepless grind. The crew lived at battle stations, snatching food and rest when they could. The ship patrolled the same 7,000-yard sector, back and forth, under constant threat. Sleep became the most precious commodity. Men wore life belts around the clock. On May 9th, the fragile luck that shielded DE-343 failed her sister ship, the Oberenda. A kamikaze slammed into the Oberenda on station A-34A. Its bomb tore through her starboard room, blowing a 10 by 25-foot hole in her hull. 8 men were killed, 53 wounded. She was towed into Karama-Reto but was found damaged beyond repair, later towed to sea and sunk by gunfire. The second ship of Escort Division 69 was gone, her crew carrying their ghosts onto the Abercrombie. The crew pressed on. On the night of May 26th, a blip appeared on the radar screen, closing fast from the starboard quarter. The general alarm clanged through the ship, every gun trained out into the darkness. On Mount 41, the 40mm mount, gunner's mate 3rd Class Robert Hawthorne stood ready. He had borrowed a set of binoculars from the quartermaster, knowing that seconds could mean the difference. The enemy plane was a twin-engine Betty bomber, flying low and straight at the ship. He spotted it first and pushed the trainer aside, spinning the mount onto the bearing. He yelled to the pointer for elevation corrections. When the crosshairs found the target, he pressed the firing key. The 40mm rounds hammered out, cherry-red tracers lancing into the night. One round hit the bomber's right engine, which exploded in a blinding white flash. The plane kept coming for a moment, then the wing ripped off. The bomber cart-wheeled into the sea, crashing 10 yards off the stern. Seawater splashed across the main deck. The empty brass casings from the 40mm mount clattered to the deck, still hot. They would stay there as souvenirs of a moment that could have ended very differently. 2 nights later, on May 28th, the enemy tried again. This time the attack came in the form of a Baka, a rocket-propelled suicide glider carrying a 2,600-pound warhead. It skimmed over the surface at 500 miles per hour, trailing a horizontal stream of fire from its tail. There was barely time to react. On Mount 52, gunner's mate, 1st Class Pete Kish, spotted the fire stream and trained his mount around. The gun swung fast, its barrel parallel to the deck. Pointer and trainer matched the markers to the sight. The instant they were on target, he gave the order to fire. 2 rounds blasted off, 10 seconds apart. The second round found its mark. The Bacca's stream of fire angled sharply downward and winked out. A moment later, a huge underwater explosion lifted the Abercrombie's stern and hurled it to starboard. The glider had been deflected into the sea, where its warhead detonated harmlessly. The ship was saved by the speed of an alert gun captain, by 2 well-aimed rounds, and by the proximity fuse in the anti-aircraft ammunition. The crew let out a cheer that echoed through the dark. On the morning of May 29th, a new kind of crisis struck the ship. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Bernard Kaczynski, had been struggling with high blood pressure. He sent a message requesting medical attention. When the boat returned from the flagship, he announced simply that he was being transferred for hospitalization. The executive officer, Lieutenant John Hicks, would take command. Kaczynski left without ceremony, no muster, no farewell. He simply gathered his gear and went over the side. The crew had never known another captain. Now, in the midst of the most dangerous waters they had faced, he was gone. The men were shaken. Kaczynski had been demanding, acerbic, and competent. They had trusted his judgment on the ping line. Now they had to place that trust in Hicks, who had been kept in the background. His nickname among the crew was not flattering: Tubby. Hicks called the crew together on the fantail and climbed onto a blower housing. He announced the change of command, but as he spoke, tears rolled down his cheeks. It was not a reassuring sight. Yet the months of training and shared hardship had forged the ship into something greater than any one man. The organization held. The watches were stood. The guns were manned. The patrol was maintained. That afternoon, the Abercrombie steamed into Keramaretto to load ammunition. The next day, she collided with the destroyer Dyson, DD-552, due to unusual swinging of both vessels, requiring repairs alongside a tender. But by the end of the month, she was back on the line. The ship had survived the change, though the unease lingered. The question now was whether her luck would hold. By the summer of 1945, the Abercrombie was operating in the China Sea as part of a heavy striking force. But the sea itself turned into an enemy as vicious as any kamikaze. A typhoon sideswiped the formation, winds exceeding 50 knots, building waves to heights that dwarfed the little destroyer escort. On the bridge, men held fast to the voice tubes as the ship rolled 54 degrees to starboard, paused and snapped back. Below in the engine rooms, temperatures soared past 120 degrees as the crew braced against hot machinery. They knew 3 destroyers had been capsized and lost in a similar storm just months before. The Abercrombie survived. When the sky cleared, the crew emerged to a ship, battered but intact. It was another narrow escape, another chapter in the string of improbable luck that had followed the ship since her commissioning. Then the news from the Radio Shack changed everything. An atomic bomb had fallen on Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki. The mess decks buzzed with a tense, disbelieving hope. On the 10th of August, while running south along the coast of Samar, the first reports of Japanese surrender negotiations crackled over the air. Stafford passed the word over the public address system. There was no wild cheering. The men were too stunned, too exhausted for that. Someone found a couple of boxes of apples and passed them around. That was how the end of the greatest war in history was marked aboard the Abercrombie. The future, long pushed aside as an impossible dream, suddenly felt real again. After weeks of occupation duty in Japan, the ship received orders to return home. Before sailing for the States, a working party was organized to gather souvenirs for the crew from a police headquarters in Tokyo. The expedition was a minor odyssey through the wreckage of a defeated empire. With the help of the 1st Cavalry Division, the men loaded a truck with over 2,000 captured rifles and 1,200 bayonets. The weapons were brought back to the ship late that night, the men wet, cold, and exhausted but triumphant. The next morning, the spoils were distributed on the forecastle. For days, the ship echoed with the sounds of cleaning and oiling as the crew prepared to take home the physical evidence of their service across the Pacific. The voyage from Japan to Pearl Harbor was plagued by a technical mystery. The Abercrombie was consuming fuel at an alarming rate, far more than her sister ships. The Commodore sent pointed messages. The engineers were baffled and frustrated. It looked as though the ship might not have enough fuel to reach Pearl. The engineers tried everything, but the cause remained hidden. The mystery was solved by sheer accident. A crewman poking along the waterline with a boat hook felt a solid object. A diver was called. An investigation revealed a 30-foot section of the bilge keel torn loose in the pounding seas and dragging as a massive break. An underwater cutting torch removed it in minutes, and the ship sailed cleanly for the final leg home. The morning of the 21st of November was clear and cool. The coast of California rose out of the haze ahead. The crew lined the rails in silence, watching the buildings of San Pedro grow from a gleam on the horizon into their long-awaited destination. The dock was hung with bunting and signs reading "Welcome" and "Well done." Red Cross girls handed out milk and donuts. At 7:22 in the morning, the first line was on the dock. The Abercrombie had returned. One by one, the men filed ashore with their sea bags. Don Wood, Ed Shue, Ralph Rice, men who had become the ship itself. Stafford watched them go, then went ashore himself to find his wife, who was waiting for him on the landing in her promised red suit. Harry Miles, the electrician's mate, went home to his family in New Bedford, and Mel Rosenberg returned to civilian life, the boxing match a lasting bond between them. The war was finally over. Hicks saw the ship through her deactivation. Parlin was detached for other duty. Hawthorne and Kish went home, their calm, perfect gunnery in the desperate seconds off Okinawa, a story they would carry quietly for the rest of their lives. The USS Abercrombie was decommissioned in 1946 and sunk as a target in 1968. But the ship was never just a hull. It was the men who served in her, the reservists and civilians who became sailors of a lethal, competent warship, and who came home without losing a single man to enemy action. That is the legacy of the little ship that wouldn't die. If you have a story from the Pacific, or a memory of a ship or a sailor from that great campaign, we would be honored to hear it in the comments below. It is how we keep this history alive. If you enjoyed this documentary, please take a moment to subscribe and give it a like. Your support means the world to us and helps bring more of these stories to light. Thank you for listening.